Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. This is part 2 of the interview with Tariq Madood. If you have not already listened to part 1, please go back and listen to that one first. In part 1, we learned all about the upbringing for Tariq when he came to England and how he got his way into sociology. And so if you haven't listened to that part, please go back. In this part, we're going to learn a little bit more about his own research, particularly in the areas of multiculturalism and secularism. So without further ado, let's go to part 2 of the interview. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about your own research. You've mentioned multiculturalism quite a lot already, and that's sort of the basis of your main research, isn't it, multiculturalism?
Yeah, I think in terms of its empirical core, it started with and therefore is never totally left a focus on British ethnic minorities, especially British Asian Muslims. And the kinds of things I've been particularly interested in is discrimination, inequality in labour markets, for instance, in access to universities, and the drive for social mobility, because these obstacles that I just referred to become most evident when groups are trying to, as it were, improve their lot. And most ethnic minorities in Britain, formed through migration from the late 1940s onwards, have this drive for social mobility, though sometimes it becomes very severely arrested when they get trapped into certain exclusions, meaning trapped into certain kinds of employment and institutional ghettos and so on. And as I was saying earlier, the sense of group identity, I think, is very important to understanding ethnic minorities over and beyond just how they fit in or don't fit in, are excluded or allowed to enter certain kinds of structures and opportunities. And I've been particularly interested in the political expression of group identities and of how they're negotiated and how they change over time. And certainly in the case of British ethnic minorities, they certainly have changed over time, from black to black and Asian to Pakistani, Indian and Bangladeshi to Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and this change is in ferment even now, and perhaps, will be all the time. And it's very strongly connected to wanting to be British, to making a claim to be British, because the groups I'm talking about came from a British background, from, if you like, the British political system in its extended geographical global form, the empire and then the Commonwealth. So people like me, like my dad anyway, already had a sense in which they were connected to Britain. They weren't just migrants, just, I'll go there because there are some job opportunities. They had a very strong sense that Britain had something to do with them and they had something to do with Britain. As you know, a lot of West Indians who came, with the Windrush and into the 1950s and so on, even into the 1960s, spoke of Britain as the mother country. And so the experience of racism was actually even more severely effective, felt because they thought they already were British and couldn't understand the racial exclusion and the othering that they experienced. So the theoretical frame in which I have approached these kinds of questions is multiculturalism, as you've noted. Now, this is largely a political theory concept. I see it as extending the idea of equal citizenship to the idea of difference, of minority identities. And the key concept here is the idea of recognition and its correlate, misrecognition. So misrecognition is where a group is treated without any interest in the group itself. It may be treated simply as a problem, a social problem. Oh, they all live in ghettos. Or as a resource. Oh, we need these people for various kinds of jobs. Or maybe controlled in various kinds of ways to do with crime and other forms of urban management. But at no point are you really interested in the minority. At no point are you trying to understand it. And so the multiculturalist says, well, that's not equality. That's not the kind of relation that should exist between equal citizens. Equal citizens owe each other some obligation to understand each other and come to sympathize and share with each other's concerns, which then become everybody's concerns, become the concerns of the citizenry of the political community. And therefore, the effort to do that is called, borrowing the term from Charles Taylor, recognition. You recognize a group in terms of their own sense of self, which of course can include their aggrieved sense of bitter exclusion and their understanding of their oppression at the hands of other people, wider society or its historical ancestors, and so on. So this makes issues around identity central to equality rather than just, of marginal interest. Equality is really all about money or power or social structures, and identity is just some kind of froth that some people have the luxury to get interested in, but most of us can't be bothered with identity because we have a family to feed and so on. No, not at all. Identity becomes absolutely central to what equal citizenship should be about. And one implication of that is that the classical liberal conception of equality, of treating everybody the same, is not enough. It's not sufficient. Of course, it's very important. It's very important in my work, very important in the work of all multiculturalists, because we do need that idea of uniformity of treatment, of uniformity of rights, as, if you like, the base of our idea of equal citizenship. The multiculturalist point is that historically has led to cultural homogenization, inattention to minority groups, or just a squashing of their identities, an indifference to their identities, and that then can't be part of equality. So equality is about uniform rights, but it can't only be about uniform rights. And therefore, sometimes we need to attend to difference and differential needs. And in British racial equality processes, probably the first argument that utilized this idea, or if it didn't expressly utilize it as a theoretical idea, that manifested itself in practice, was the Sikh campaign to be allowed to wear a turban at work, when the employer said, well, no, you can't wear anything on your head because we don't wear things on our heads in Britain or in our workplace or whatever. Or the employer had a uniform requirement and the turban wasn't part of the uniform. Maybe a peaked cap was, like a bus conductor or something like that. And in the late 1960s onwards, the Sikhs fought a campaign to have their turban recognized So this is exactly what multiculturalism is about, to have their turban recognized as important to them, of the kind that they weren't willing to give up just for the sake of a workplace rule. And I think that since then, we've seen much more unfolding of multiculturalist ideas. But these ideas should be built on racial equality ideas, because, as I said, the uniform idea of equality is also very important. We can't give up on that. And so multiculturalism is a building on that. It's an extra. And therefore, in my own work, certainly, I've seen multiculturalism as building on racial equality and anti-racism. And in some way, Britain both pioneered a certain understanding of anti-racism, it initially very much borrowed from the United States, but has also developed a form of multiculturalism which makes racialization of groups, and therefore the deracialization of groups, the equalizing of citizenship, has made that central in the way that it's not, for instance, in Canadian multiculturalism, either in theory or practice, or Australian multiculturalism, or even in American multiculturalism, though that's a slightly more complicated topic, because they have less of what you might call state multiculturalism and more of a kind of civil society politics. And certainly the African American struggle for identity and dignity and respect is a very important part of my understanding of multiculturalism and of, I think, what we've tried to do in Britain. And so I've brought this understanding to bear on social and political struggles of minorities in Britain for equal citizenship and for acceptance as fully British, as equal British. And therefore, I've kind of tried to give some theoretical content through this sociological and political inquiries that I've been involved in, but also, as I say, to frame those inquiries in ways informed much more, really, I've got to say, by political theory than by social theory or sociology more broadly. And that's why I see myself very much as occupying an interdisciplinary position rather than that of what one might call a pure sociologist, if there is such a thing. And in fact, I've come to recently characterize this approach as normative sociology. And the reason I call it that is not simply because the phenomena I'm studying, like political struggles or discrimination and equal opportunity policies and so on, are normative, employ normative concepts. Because in a way, all sociology, I think, all sociology can study normative concepts, phenomena, and actually employs normative concepts. The person who does a social science survey in order to get a measure of the extent of racial discrimination in a particular social domain is employing a normative concept of equality and inequality, of discrimination and non-discrimination. No, I want to go beyond that, because, as I say, I think all sociologists do that. I want to critically engage with the normative concepts themselves as we use them. So I want to engage with the concept of equality. I don't just want to use the concept of equality to do a body of empirical research or a body of discourse analysis. I want to say, well, what is this concept of equality? What are its variations? How have we come to have this concept? What are the, as it were, the sequence of ideas, of thinking that have led us to this point? And of course, how do they connect with the political struggles? Because I very much want to see the ideas connected to political contestation and struggles. And also, not just what are they, but what's good or bad about them, meaning what are the strengths and weaknesses here if we are committed to equality? And how can we therefore improve our existing stock of concepts for something better? How can we criticize and improve? And I'm emphasize both those things together, criticize and improve, because I think in recent sociology on social theory, there has been a tendency to just do one, criticize. Yeah. We talk about deconstruction, problematizing, favorite sociological thing. What are you doing? Oh, I'm problematizing X. Well, yes, but what follows after that? Having problematized it, have we got nothing more to say about it? So if you like, I want to offer something positive as well as something negative. If a critique through problematizing is the negative moment in engaging with certain discourses and practices informed by those ideas and discourses, then okay, what would be the positive movement forward from where we are, from what we've just sociologically established seems to be the case in a certain policy domain, or in the country as a whole, or in the minds and practices of certain classes of people or certain categories of the population, and so on. And so that's why I call it, as I said, normative sociology, because it wants to pursue the normative logic and not just establish its sociological presence or absence. It wants to pursue the normative logic in order to offer a positive contribution about how the phenomena that we're studying, which we think is problematic, could become less problematic, and hopefully not just slightly less problematic, but over time, much less problematic, be transformed.
So in terms of to make multiculturalism positive, then, critics would say that if you give people more individuality to practice what they want, or their religion or their dress, that's counterproductive to multiculturalism, if that makes sense. How do you allow individuality and multiculturalism to sit side by side?
Yeah, well, I think there are very few sociologists that can be persuaded that society is just about individuals. I mean, Michael Banton, who I mentioned earlier, and who actually was my predecessor at the University of Bristol, he and I used to argue about this. So, because he thought that how individuals act, in particular, what kind of decisions they make when they're presented with certain options about choosing to live in neighborhood X or choosing to live in neighborhood Y, or buying from this shop rather than that shop, or job opportunities and so on, that the decisions that people make follow a certain kind of rational calculation about what they think serves their interest. And, we can identify that, we can analyze that, and we can see that it leads to certain aggregative outcomes. So the individual is not trying to create a societal outcome, they're just trying to make the best decision for themselves, but there are these outcomes. And in a way, this is a way of thinking that we mostly find in economics, the discipline of economics. But very few sociologists believe that society is made up of just individuals and their actions. So we already have to have some kind of collective concepts, class, women, ethnicity. So we already are talking about collective phenomena, group phenomena. So it's not like my multiculturalism is introducing that and it's somehow squashing or marginalizing individuality, that I'm kind of devaluing individuality. I think any sociological inquiry has to go beyond just individuals. But the multiculturalism that I talk about must respect individual rights, because, I don't think the multiculturalism is what some people call liberal multiculturalism, say like that of Will Kimlicka, but it is a multiculturalism that has grown out of and can only be contextualized in the context of at least a partly liberal democratic society like that of Britain or the United States or Canada and so on, though of course each will have their own specificities in relation to that. But anyway, so certainly a robust frame, legal framework of rights, individual rights, is something that I think all multiculturalism I know of in political theory respect that. But we also recognize that people have group affiliations and ways of relating to each other that can't be understood in terms of individuals, and that sometimes what they're seeking in their own lives is not just what we might call individual autonomy. I think everybody wants individual autonomy to some degree or other, but that's a very big qualification, to some degree or other. What degree? Not everybody seeks it in the same degree, just as everybody seeks security in their lives, stability in their lives to some degree or other. But we know that people have different understandings, for instance, of risk, of whether to give up this job because I think I can get another better career if I take this path later. Deferred gratification, for instance, another kind of calculation about should I be doing this or benefit from something else later. So autonomy, liberal individuality, for some people is the highest good. And I understand that, but it's not for other people. And I think that a liberal regime that tries to make everybody liberals is going to be fundamentally illiberal, because it's going to have to give up on the idea that people find their own paths, that people, are the products of their own choices, even though, of course, as a matter of fact, they're not the product of their own choices because there are too many social forces at work. But recognizing that people might place a higher value on, for instance, the family, as I know a lot of people of South Asian origin do, and I'm not saying they're the only ones, but it's an example I'm very familiar with. A lot of people make choices that put their family above their individual autonomy, either at certain stages in their life or a number of stages in their lives. Parents do this for their children, including for their adult children, and adult children do it for their siblings and parents and the extended family as well. So they don't always put their individuality, their rational calculation of individual interest and benefit first. Or another way of putting this, and this is how Bhikkhu Parekh puts it, is that actually we can't understand the individual without understanding their family, because their family is part of their understanding of the individual that they are, of what it is to be that individual. So that's quite a good way of putting it. Yeah. So I don't see multiculturalism as being anti-individualist, certainly when it comes to issues around legal rights and the enforcement of legal rights. But even as a social philosophy, as a social ethos, of course, multiculturalism values things other than the individual. And so, if you like, it wants to value the multi-values rather than a hierarchy of values or putting one value above all the others, namely that of liberal individuality or autonomy.
So I just think that how important then is something like assimilation? Because is assimilation moving towards homogeny and depriving people of their individuality, or is it a good thing?
So it depends on, firstly, are we talking about voluntary assimilation or assimilation with lots of social pressure, or some kind of legal requirement? Okay, so very few people would make it a legal requirement, especially in this day and age. So we'll put that to one side. But forcing people to assimilate, I mean, even through, like, for instance, discriminating against those people, for instance, who seem to, well, like the Sikh turban case. You say, oh, well, look, just assimilate, take off your turban, cut your hair, just be like one of us, and we'll respect you for that. I think that's entirely wrong. Yes, that is not what I understand by multicultural equality. But if people choose to assimilate, I mean, and I see this in my own life, I've assimilated in all kinds of ways. I might have made different choices if I was to live my life all over again. But nevertheless, being now the person that I am, I can see that some of my biography can be described in terms of assimilation. Some of it can be described as an assertion of a minority identity, and so on. So if it's voluntary, I don't think multiculturalists should object. So I personally, some might do, but I personally don't think that multiculturalists should be, as it were, tutting people who prefer to assimilate. You know, like a lot of people see the fact that we now have so many British Asians, especially British Indians, at the top of the Conservative Party and in government at the moment. And, you know, some of them are given very derogatory and insulting descriptions. I think that's entirely wrong. I think, people should be free to be British Indian in their own way. And if that means more assimilation than someone else thinks is right for what it means to be a British Indian, well, so be it. Of course, neither party should be able to force the other into their way. So that's why I emphasize the voluntary nature of it. There will always be some social pressures. You can't get rid of social pressures. I mean, parents pressure their children to do homework before they go out and play football in the park. Yeah. I mean, you know, the fact that we're all wanting to look cool or to look expensive, you know, posh and so on. I mean, these are all various kinds of social pressures, some not so subtle either. So society is full of social pressures, but nevertheless, where you're not directly forcing people by, for instance, giving them shameful, derogatory name calling if you think they're too assimilated and so on, I think people should be free to make their own choices and rank their own priorities and values.
One area I also wanted to just ask you about is, I know you write quite significantly on secularization as well. And there are those that argue, you know, the true sort of route to equality is through secularism, if you didn't have religion. But where does that kind of stand in your argument? Because that's kind of anti-multiculturalism, isn't it?
Yeah. So firstly, I'd want to make a distinction between secularization, which is a sociological process or a number of big sociological processes, and secularism, because an ism always means that there are some ideas at work. And I'm interested in the secularism rather than just the processes. Secondly, within secularism, I'd want to make a distinction between secularism as a kind of metaphysics, for instance, a metaphysics that says there is no God, there is no afterlife, you know, the kind of Richard Dawkins view of the world, and what I call political secularism, which is about how should we arrange our political affairs so that religious authority, which we can respect, does not interfere with political authority. And that's my kind of minimalist understanding of political secularism. And then I'm interested in the kind of political secularism that exists in countries like Britain and in Northwestern Europe and some other parts of the world. So I think that a political secularism that is difference-phobic, especially religious difference-phobic, and wants to marginalize religious people in the public space, I think that must be hostile to multiculturalism and vice versa. That multiculturalism can't be compatible with that kind of what I call radical secularism. And if we want a real world reference point, I would say that this is how a lot of French Republicans understand their own country, understand its laïcité. There are other French politicians, theorists, activists who have a more sympathetic, that is to say sympathetic to religion, understanding of laïcité as well. Sometimes it's called open laïcité, but they're probably in a relatively small minority in France. So radical secularism as a political idea, forgetting about anything to do with Richard Dawkins, as a political idea is incompatible with multiculturalism, as I understand it, and as I think quite a lot of political theorists understand it. On the other hand, the kind of secularism, political secularism that we have in Britain, but also I would say there's kind of an arc of northwestern Europe, which is actually the old, Protestant or Protestant Catholic countries, from England right up to Finland, including, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, etc. If we look at those countries, I think that what we don't find is a separation of state and church, or at least not an absolute separation. We find some people might be calling for that, but it's not what exists, and it's not even what the majority are in favor of. So they're not clamoring to have more separation. They, for instance, support either the teaching of some religion in state schools, or they fund faith schools out of the public purse. They, in the case of Germany, enormous amounts of federal taxpayers' money is channeled into welfare services, not through state organizations, but church-based organizations, welfare organizations, and so on. And of course, in Britain, we have an establishment of the Church of England, and our monarch is tied to the Church of England, our monarch being our head of state, and bishops sit in the House of Lords, and we have, a very significant sector of our schooling run by church organizations, church and other religious organizations. Jewish people now have a very significant presence in English schooling relative to their number of Jewish pupils. So that secularism, which I call moderate secularism, I think can be multiculturalized, because what it offers to a dominant church or to a dominant religion can be extended to include other faiths. And I think this is exactly what we have been doing in Britain, not necessarily led by theory, but just what has been happening in practice. It's been happening at a national level through things like decisions about school fundings, about consultations with ministers and Whitehall, who's called in to speak about what topics and so on, about some national legislation, making, for instance, religious discrimination very substantial. That's the same equal level as all other forms of discrimination, which it didn't used to be. And I think of even the Church of England, I think has been actively encouraging minority faiths to come to have a place in the British public space and infrastructure. I think the Queen is supportive of it, as is Prince Charles, who one assumes will be the next monarch. So I think there are aspects of our political secularism that have been drifting towards or evolving towards a multiculturalism, and I would like to build on that. Say, let's be open about it and let's take it further. Let's have not just bishops, but people of other faiths in the House of Lords. Let's not just have Christianity given a special kind of place in religious education or religious instruction, but other faiths too, if they want it. Because this relates to the assimilation argument. Some faiths don't want that. They say, look, we can teach our children their faith or our faith ourselves. Our community will do it, on a kind of Sunday school basis. Schools should be all about, maths and English, not about gurus and nirvana. Well, okay, if that's their choice. But other minorities shouldn't be dictated by the choice of some other group, whether it's a minority or a majority. So if, say, Hindus say we don't need anything special at school, but Muslims and Sikhs say, well, we do, we need, for instance, halal food or Jewish children kosher food and so on, or some religious instruction, an imam or a rabbi coming in at a particular time in the school day. It could even be in the lunchtime, but it could also be within the timetable, or it could be the end of school and so on. But it's seen as part of what is a legitimate thing to do within the school, that the school is supportive of it, the school includes it. I think that's a way of multiculturalizing the secularism that I'm talking about. So it's a secularism that finds a place for religion, doesn't try to exclude it in the way that I said that French Republican intellectuals and politicians try to do. And as I say, I think, therefore, secularism is both now a kind of what you might call a frontier of multiculturalism, where over the last 20 years, so much of the arguments about multiculturalism have been taking place on this frontier about the place of religion in public life, including issues around dress and so on. But also, it can become, given the kind of multiculturalism, the kind of secularism that we have, it can become a vehicle for promoting multiculturalism in one part of our public space, just as we can promote it in other ways, like, universities or broadcasting or politics in other ways.
So maybe I could make this the final question, actually, because what you've just described is a huge amount of progress and evolution and so on. Why do you think there is still that perception? David Cameron famously said multiculturalism has failed. Despite all of the things you said and the progress that we can see, why is there that perception that to some degree it's not worked?
Yes. I think, in fairness, it's worth recognizing that critics of what Cameron called state multiculturalism don't just come from the right or the centre-right. Some left-wing multiculturalists using multiculturalism with a small m have also been critical of the state. So they can be in favour of everyday multiculturalism, or people just mixing together, but believe that when the state gets involved, because of the nature of state power or because of the specific history of a particular state, the state kind of corrupts what it touches. Obviously, that's not my view, because I give the state an important role to play in creating and sustaining equal citizenship, and therefore also multiculturalism. I think that it is the case that there are places in some English towns and cities where communities marked by ethnicity and religion are quite separated. They lead what was being called parallel lives. And this is, of course, one of the main things that Cameron was getting at. But in so doing, he was picking up on what we might call the statistical norm in relation to the presence of ethnic minority groups. But nevertheless, there are some cases. So if you like, he was dismissing all so-called state multiculturalism by reference to one phenomenon, which I might also accept is a bad case. But he didn't show any causal connection between any state policies and the fact that there are segregated communities. So I don't accept that multiculturalism as an ism, or even any policies to do with it, are responsible for it. I think that there's a historical legacy of where people settled. I think that that's often shaped by poverty or low income, by where jobs are available for people without certain kinds of skills or limitations in the use of English. I'm going back, historically. And I think that issues of racial exclusion and discrimination are very pertinent to the shaping of segregated communities, as is the phenomenon of white flight. So it's not like that minorities set out to create segregated communities or are happy at the outcome. They actually are not. There's quite a lot of research to show that if you ask, for instance, some Asian people in places like Bradford and Leeds and so on, they regret the fact that their neighbourhood has become as ethnically or religiously homogenous as it has. And they haven't moved into that neighbourhood. Other people have moved out. White people have moved out. But of course, their numbers, that Muslim Asian numbers, have grown just through natural reproduction. But no multiculturalist is in favour of what I've just described, segregated communities based on a historical legacy of discrimination and poverty. I mean, this is a structural disadvantage that state multiculturalism should be tackling. We shouldn't be just accepting it as a kind of laissez-faire, though, of course, by which I don't mean that we can tell people they should go and live somewhere else. You can't say, oh, there are too many Muslims in Bradford, you must go and live somewhere else. But I think that certainly policies at a local level which are aimed at bringing different communities together, for instance, redrawing some school catchment areas or twinning schools, though that's really quite a small policy. I think that attacking job discrimination and occupational segregation, I think that's very important. And when the local government is doing this, it's doing it as a local state, i.e. we have a form of local state multiculturalism. So state multiculturalism is not the cause. There's no evidence, and Cameron or anyone else haven't shown that it's state multiculturalism that causes the issues, the social conditions that we've just been referring to, and which I accept are not a good state of affairs. But I deny that they're anything to do with multiculturalism. And on the other hand, I've been saying to you that multiculturalism at a local and a national level, state level, is part of what is needed in order to avoid that situation, which isn't the norm in British towns and cities anyway. But where it does exist, we need action, not inaction.
Thank you. I asked today if I could have 30, 40 minutes of your time, and you've been extremely generous and given me a huge amount more. So I'd like to really thank you for that. And just for the listeners, so they can find out more about you, where else can they read more about your work, your books, and so on?
Well, I have a website, which is tariqmadood.com, all in lowercase, and nearly all of my work is on that website. Some of it you can just download. Some of it is just there as a reference that you can take into Google Scholar or something. And there are also actually quite a lot of video clips and podcasts and so on that website as well.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Tariq. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.